No problem.
Hi, I'm Michael Church, a flight instructor with over 50 years experience. Welcome to the Talk Flying Podcast, a show dedicated to the elevation of flight training.
And I'm Ty Frisby, a captain with Alaska Airlines. In the Talk Flying Podcast, Michael and I will share our experience in the pursuit of aviation excellence.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome back to the Talk Flying Podcast, Episode 2, The Pursuit of Perfection. In Episode 1, we identified 4 areas where we believe flight training is going astray. Avoidance as a way of dealing with risk, the minimization of solo and genuine PIC, the use of technology as a substitute for pilot skill, and teaching for the test. In our introduction, we used the phrase dedicated to the elevation of flight training through the pursuit of excellence. This episode is titled The Pursuit of Perfection, and we got that from Vince Lombardi. He said, "Perfection is not attainable, but if we chase perfection, we can catch excellence." And that really sums up our philosophy in flight training, Michael. Before we get started with the solution, I want to ask you, how did we get to this place to begin with? How did flight training go astray?
It's important to recognize that when we talk about flight training and flight training philosophy, our concentration is on general aviation, not on the air carrier side of things, where changes are made on a fairly regular basis that influence how pilots respond and change technique as necessary to accommodate new discoveries or new realizations about the pursuit of safety. In general aviation, we've been going in the other direction. Standards have relaxed. The first of these changes occurred in the late 1940s, and interestingly, as far long ago as that was, it seems like everybody knows that spins were eliminated from private pilot training, and in fact from all ratings and certificates, with the exception of flight instructors. It was decided by the FAA that we didn't need to improve the quality of instruction. We simply could deal with this risk area by avoiding. And so spins were reduced to theory only. The next thing that changed was a very interesting decision made by the FAA. This was the early 50s, when it was decided that in logging flight time, it was practical or it was permissible to log as pilot in command any time that the keeper of the logbook acted as sole manipulator of the controls of an aircraft, that they were or are rated to fly. Okay, so the average private pilot graduates with a private pilot certificate rated in an airplane single-engine land. No high-performance experience, no complex experience, to name 2. No tail wheel, I'll toss that in there to name 3. That means that my private pilot graduate can get into the front seat of a 2-place P-51 Mustang, and as long as she operates as the sole manipulator of the controls, can log as PIC time, all the while in this 2,000 horsepower machine with a tail wheel, okay, and a full set of complex controls. They aren't authorized to act as PIC, but they can log it as PIC. And I think you can see that right away a disrespect for the concept of pilot in command was born. As a result, I've had students come to me. These are students in search of a CFI certificate. And they come to me for the spin training, which is part of the requirements, and they have never done a STOL without a flight instructor or an examiner in the right seat. And I said, "You've never done a pilot in command STOL?" "Yeah, they're pilot in command."
Oh.
Okay. Well, they're not. Okay.
Right.
The pilot in command is the person who is solely responsible for the outcome of a flight. Another way of putting that is the flight instructor is the person who gets blamed.
Yeah.
Okay. And finally, worth pointing out, a flight instructor, or the PIC, I should say, is authorized to violate any of the Part 91 regulations as necessary in that pilot's opinion to meet the needs of an emergency. There can only be one such person on board the airplane. You can't have 2 people logging PIC and thinking of themselves as PIC. It doesn't work. The next big change came in the mid-1990s. And this is when it was apparent that, okay, things are really actually going to go downhill. The FAA cut the minimum solo requirement for a student in search of a private pilot certificate by 50%. And they did so specifically in order to reduce cost. It was cynical. That pilot is going to get those hours anyway, but the fact that they were lopped off the private pilot requirements meant that they weren't done, those hours were not flown under the supervision of a flight instructor. A timidity began to develop in the graduates simply because they had less opportunity to do things they had wondered about, like 45-degree bank turns. How come we do them on tests and we don't do them normally flying? They could have asked those questions of a flight instructor. Were they still in that person's care and feeding? But once the certificate's been earned, the private pilot is to the greatest degree simply on their own.
Yeah. You used the word timid, and the opposite of timid is confident. And I think that's really what you get out of solo time, especially during the private pilot training when you're out soloing, is you gain confidence. How could you not? I mean, you're the one that's out there flying. There's nobody with you. It's 100% you. That is very confidence inspiring.
It is, I think, the most valuable time that the pilot basically gets to have that qualifies as training. I think that you can all ask yourselves, when is the pace of learning highest? With somebody more qualified than you in the right seat, or when you're entirely by yourself? And I can assure you that even today, the most intense experience for me is when I am entirely by myself in an airplane. Somehow, the absence of a distracting person just changes the quality and the nature of the experience.
Now, I have a question. You said that these pilots will get this solo time anyways.
Yeah.
But that's actually not really true anymore, though, because later on, the commercial pilot requirements for solo were changed. So the pilot may only ever get that 5 or 10 hours of solo time from their private pilot, really, because now for the commercial pilot, they get to bring an emotional support CFI with them instead of. Now, I didn't make that up. I stole that from DPE Steve.
It's very clever.
Who's really, I like his content. If you haven't seen DPE Steve, look him up on Instagram. But he's a DPE, and that's what he calls this. I don't know what it's technically called. When you get to bring a flight instructor with you while you're performing your what used to be solo during the commercial pilot training process.
The commercial is the next place that the quality and standards were reduced, and that is one of the changes. Prior to that, however, in the early 2000s, stalls were changed markedly for commercial pilots. Commercial applicants used to have to do more stalls, more different types of stalls than were private applicants. That went away to the point where the FAA said, okay, we are actually more interested in learning and teaching avoidance than experience. And so commercial applicants are not to do stalls during the task called stalls in the PTS. If the commercial applicant on the check ride were to do a stall, they would flunk. They had been told very specifically, recognize, call imminent stall, reduce angle of attack, and fly out of it. To do anything else would be demonstration of poor judgment. And so commercial applicants simply didn't do stalls. Now that lasted only 3 or 4 years in the early 2000s, maybe a little longer than that. And then the FAA, responding to some pressure, I'm not sure from where it came, changed the ACS at the discretion of the examiner. A full stall could be included as opposed to just recognition and recovery from imminent stalls. That required the invention of a new term, full stall. And I'm afraid this is an awful lot like pregnancy, okay? You either are or you aren't. That's gone, and I don't know any examiners now who don't ask for a full stall.
Okay. So it's at the examiner's discretion. They can ask for an eminent stall or a full stall now?
Yes.
One or the commercial?
Other. Yes, at the commercial check ride level.
Okay.
Good.
Interesting.
And by the way, that's it. If that examiner does choose to ask for a full stall, assuming that the pilot being tested has no interest in becoming a flight instructor, that is easily the last stall they will ever do. Flight instructors are still required to teach them, but as I say, I've had applicants come to me for the spin endorsement prior to their CFI check ride who have never done a stall without an examiner or a flight instructor in the seat next to them. And the first time I ran into this, I was horrified. I said, you're going to be teaching flying, and you've never done a pilot in command stall. Well, they were pilot in command. And they certainly were. They were logged that way. So you made reference to solo. So for decades, commercial applicants were required to do 2 solo tasks. One, a 300-mile cross-country to include at least 250 miles from the point of original departure, solo. And the second is 5 hours, or was 5 hours of night, solo. The FAA simply changed this a little less than a decade ago and said that it is now legal with a flight instructor in the right seat, provided that the applicant, or commercial applicant to be, right, operates and takes responsibility for the duties and responsibilities of pilot in command. I'm sorry, that is nonsense.
Yeah.
There's only one pilot in command there, and that's not that person.
Right.
Nevertheless, it doesn't log as a dual flight, even though there's a flight instructor on board. I can assure you that were there an accident, the FAA, would probably be confused, but the insurance company wouldn't. Who was PIC? Oh, the flight instructor. Was she getting paid? She was PIC. Okay? Why did they do this? What pressure were they responding to in eliminating solo? And in order to understand that, you'd have to understand, well, why did it say solo in the first place? So there's the real value. Why insist that those thousands of commercial applicants, right, did that 300-mile cross-country by themselves? Why was it considered to be essential that that flight be solo? Because things are going to happen. Decisions have to be made, or problems have to be solved that are simply different if there's a flight instructor in the right seat. If she or he has a question, they're going to turn to the flight instructor and get an answer. It's inevitable.
Yeah. So we have the change from commercial pilot solo requirements to being able to bring their emotional support CFI along with them. Are there any other changes that have led us to this point?
Yes. Because of the technology now present in many GA cockpits, the category of TAA, technically advanced airplane. A technically advanced aircraft is one that has a 2-axis autopilot, a primary flight display, and a multifunction display, PFD and MFD, which means that I would have flight instructors coming in to work for me who had never flown a retractable airplane, never flown an airplane with a constant speed or a controllable pitch propeller. When you get to the airlines, I expect that they think that you've probably got some experience with those two systems.
Well, this is kind of news to me that a pilot can be a commercial pilot and has never put the wheels up and down.
Maybe we could have a little lever that made a noise, like,
Yeah, that's pretty funny.
Given the number who do somehow manage to land their retractable aircraft without the gear, this seems like a really bad idea. Every go-around requires a gear decision. Every takeoff, every landing, they require gear decisions. I am mystified. There are schools that buy in thoroughly to all of the changes that we've outlined, the 4 major areas in which standards have been relaxed and goals have been compromised. I would call those schools co-pilot schools. So, and when that struck me, I thought, no, it actually makes a great deal of sense. There is a feeling that the reason to learn to fly is to put yourself in the right seat of a turbine aircraft, of an air carrier or a transport category airplane. That's the goal. I'm going to have a lot to say in episodes to come that it didn't seem to me that that's anything that I ever heard Charles Lindbergh endorse. And I do know this, that if you're 5, 6, 7 years old and you see a bird flying, you aren't wondering to yourself about the career opportunity. You're just thinking, that looks like fun. How do they do that?
What's really interesting is I think these schools have this idea that what the airlines want is a co-pilot. The airlines don't want a co-pilot. They want a future captain.
Not only are they not building future captains, they're not building future flight instructors. If you think about the way this works, the FAA is in the business of establishing minimum standards. Somebody had to. It has to be a 45-degree bank plus or minus 100-foot altitude change up or down and so forth. Those standards are minimum. which means that it's adequate to achieve them and nothing better. Examiners are tasked with the exact same chore. Take an applicant and make sure that the applicant, at the very least, meets the minimum standard. So now we have two very powerful influences that are not looking for excellence. They are looking for minimums.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so where does that change? It changes with the flight instructor and it changes with the student. Okay, each is equally important. The student has to want to get better, but how are they going to get the idea of what better would be if it wasn't taught and insisted on by the flight instructor? So the quality of the flight instructor is everything to, as I see it, the future of our industry. Certainly, it is the quality of the instructor is key to having fun.
Speaking of Charles Lindbergh, I know he was a big inspiration for you.
It was interesting growing up in the Caribbean because he and Anne flew around a lot in the Caribbean, and the beach where I used to swim every Saturday was Lindbergh Bay, because he had landed in a cow field that they had to sort of level off, which is where the current airport is now. He was just sort of part of life in the Caribbean. Interesting, because he was such an explorer. He didn't just quit because he went across the North Atlantic and found France. So in his book, The Spirit of St. Louis, he identified 3 corners of a triangle that he said comprise the elements that attract people to aviation and keep them attracted. And in the order in which he listed them, they were science, adventure, and romance. And that stuck with me. And I saw it as kind of a challenge. The science part, obviously, he led with that. It was the 1920s, and a lot needed to be found out still about flying. Today, if you were to show a Cessna 150 to the Wright brothers, they would kiss your toes.
Right.
We have figured out flying, at least at the general aviation level, and all the way actually through the air carrier level. That means that I would put science in slightly different position in the order. Next came adventure, and there is no question. We've talked a lot about solo. I've talked a lot about solo, and that's where the adventure is to a very large degree. It's anathema, obviously, to the airlines. You don't want your captain going to the door of the cabin at the end of the flight going, boy, that was some flight. But
Right.
On the other hand, adventure really was a tremendous part, for me, of the attraction. That, as I said last time, the idea of being entirely responsible for my own life first occurred to me in parachuting and then in flying. And it's very, very true that flying really underscores the idea that you've entered into a world of increased risk that requires a matching amount of concentration and good judgment. And then the last of the 3 elements he named romance. Flying is beautiful. To my way of thinking, there are 2 reasons to fly, and neither one of them, in my case, had a great deal to do with money. One is the challenge, the never-ending list of available challenges to confront, to deal with, perhaps to come close to mastering. And then here comes another one. Flying is a wonderful source of a sense of satisfaction of achievement. And
Right.
the other reason to fly, frankly, it's going to seem obvious, is the view. It's extraordinary. It's a miracle. It's a privilege to be able to fly and to enjoy this view. And what happens when a student pilot to be walks into a flight school, the first question should be, why are you learning to fly? And it's not. The first question is, how would you like to sit here and I'll teach you to fly? That wasn't the question. We should find out why people are learning to fly. We should find out what is it about flying that attracts you? What is it you're hoping to get out of it? And I'm hoping I don't hear career. I'm hoping I don't hear money. What I say is, well, you got to learn if you love it first, if you love flying, and then you have to find out if you love learning to fly. And after those 2 things have a positive answer, then maybe you could figure out, how could I make a living doing this? Okay? And the first lesson that you give shouldn't be 4 forces. It should be something preparing the person, the student, to look for 3 areas of learning: science, adventure, and romance.
And if I'm not mistaken, Lindbergh said that those three areas were represented equally, right?
That's right. One, science wins. You can probably talk to that. Every flight instructor learns the science of flying, and every flight instructor feels obligated to start teaching science immediately.
So what's
Okay.
really missing from flight training culture and philosophy today is the adventure and the romance. The adventure, a lot of that comes from solo flying. The romance is maybe just appreciating the moment and having an emotional connection with the activity itself of flying.
What I envision is something that I hope happens with every student pilot. But the truth is that learning to fly isn't necessarily fun. It certainly doesn't give you a lot of opportunity to engage in or enjoy the adventure and romance part because there's somebody sitting next to you constantly earning her money, right? Telling you what to do, criticizing what you did. What I hope is that somewhere on maybe the first or second solo cross country, the student has a moment of relaxation where the next waypoint is clear, the timing is working out, fuel is managed, I'm not lost. I don't think I'm going to get lost. And then suddenly it's like, wow, look at this.
This is beautiful.
This is beautiful.
Right.
And ideally, the whole learning process should aim to encourage those types of realizations and those types of moments as you learn to fly.
Yeah. And as an airline pilot, I can say that it doesn't go away. I mean, science, romance, and adventure is how I think of my job. It's equal parts. We have to stay sharp and know our systems and know our procedures, be ready for recurrent training and everything. That's the science. The adventure is constantly going to different airports with different weather conditions. And as an airline pilot, you're actually dealing with a lot of moving parts. An airline is kind of like a giant Rube Goldberg machine with all these gears and stuff. So to keep the thing moving, you have to be cognizant of that and aware of it. And you're doing a lot of problem solving. And then the romance is just when you're sitting there in cruise and you get to appreciate that view, like you said, the stars, the aurora, the sunrises and sunsets. Sometimes they last for hours.
And it's interesting because your view is very, very different from that of the passengers. One of the things that always disappoints me in when I get in an air carrier is all the shades are down. And they're down while we're taxiing, and they're down when we take off, and then
I
they're
know.
down while we're cruising. I can kind of see that. And then they're down for landing, you know. Sometimes somebody will be sort of surprised. What was that bump? Oh, we landed. Okay. It's you're just sitting in this tube with no view.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. When the flight attendants come up during our bathroom breaks, they go, "Wow, it's so beautiful up here. You get to see everything. We got the big windows."
Yeah.
And we're just sitting there enjoying our time, looking at the most beautiful view. It's a great job. People from our world, like the tailwheel aerobatic world, tend to kind of look down on more traditional and conventional forms of flying, like an airline flying culture. But I'm here to tell you that it's actually really incredible. As long as you do it in a balanced way and you don't lose sight of what Charles Lindbergh said, I think it can be a very rewarding career.
That's great to hear.
Michael, when did this concept of pursuing perfection to attain excellence, when did that work its way in for you in the flight training process?
It was a slow process, there's no question, but I will give great credit to a stroke of luck. And in fact, I will say that for every student pilot, there's an element of luck. You walk into a flight school, you don't necessarily have any clue as to what you're getting. Not only do you not know what you don't know, but you have no real way of judging the quality. And so you just kind of hand it over. Okay, please teach me to fly. And
Right.
I've never had an applicant ever tell me that what they had in mind was becoming an average pilot. I think everybody who learns to fly, who starts the process, wants to be excellent. Okay. And then it's a matter of luck. And I was extraordinarily lucky. In the first 300 or 400 hours that I taught, I ran into a clutch of glider pilots. And this was in the Caribbean. This group of pilots really didn't have career in mind. They were simply having fun soaring, meeting the challenges of soaring, and then eventually teaching others to do it. Think about a glider flight and how significantly different it is than a powered flight. When you pull the release, you're in an emergency condition. There is no do-overs. You either do manage energy correctly or you don't. And if you don't manage energy correctly, ideally you land out without damage to the machine. That was so challenging and so much fun and so much more difficult than doing all of that stuff with an engine that the idea of getting better never got old. Well, it's a sport. There's no reason to go soaring if it's not simply to attempt to master the elements over which you have limited control. And then when I started flying aerobatics, it was humiliating. There were 14 people flying in the sportsman category. I finished 10th. But it was also eye-opening. These guys fly better than I do. I wonder if I could do that. Challenge is fun unless you lose every time. And there's only one game I can think of attached to flying where you lose every time. And that, of course, is the game that you play with gravity. So we'll leave that for another time and another episode. So I got to stand on the platform every now and then, but most of the time there were simply people who practiced more than I did, who worked at it harder than I did, and whatever excuses I made, they flew better than I did. That's important. If you want to get better, it really helps to have a objective standard against which you can measure yourself.
Yeah. I felt like I made the most rapid progress once I got into competition aerobatics. You mentioned that it's a sport when you were talking about soaring. I think you were telling me one time that you were at an auto racing event and the Honda team was there with like a stethoscope listening to the engine as they're revving it up.
Ruining their ears.
Yeah.
Destroying them.
But absolute dedication to the advancement of this technology. And then obviously Honda as an automobile company is just unbelievable now, probably to a large extent because of their dedication to motorsports.
On a slightly less expensive and less exotic level, when I first started doing instrument training, it was at the Santa Monica Airport. I had about 1,000 hours because the instrument was not required for teaching. I wish it were that way again. But at any rate, there was a gentleman in a Bell 47, the MASH helicopter, big bubble, and I could see that there was nobody in it with him. And he was over in one corner of the airfield, and he would lift off and hover practice, and then he would land, and then next thing I know, he would lift off again. And the next time I went, he was still doing it. And I asked my instructor, do you have any idea who he is? And he said, oh, yeah, you probably know the name. That's Bob Hoover. Okay.
Yeah.
Arguably, put a number on it. One of the best 100 pilots in the world?
Oh.
10?
Yeah.
At any
10.
rate, what he was doing was what you have to do in the pursuit of excellence. You have to try to be perfect.
Yeah, in our intro, we used the phrase pursuit of excellence, but this episode is called the pursuit of perfection because if you're not trying to be perfect, then you'll settle. You'll think you're excellent and you'll settle. Bob Hoover's book is called Forever Flying. And I think that's a great title, right? Because what did he do when he was flying? He was practicing. I doubt he just went up and just flew without learning something. He was always getting better. Nobody embodies that better than Bob Hoover.
Well, it changed my life watching that, although I would imagine that it took over a decade for the lesson to actually sink in. If somebody that good needs to practice that much, then there's room for me to grow.
I know you're a big Charles Lindbergh fan. I am a big fan of Richard Bach, and we are going to do a book giveaway. I personally think that nobody has embodied this concept of the pursuit of perfection better than Richard Bach. So I've got 10 copies of Richard Bach's most famous work, Jonathan Livingston Seagul, which is a fable about a seagull that thinks there's more to life than just finding food. He appreciates the fact that he's been given this gift of flight, and he just tries to perfect his flying abilities. It's a really wonderful story and inspirational for any pilot that's in the training process. So we're going to give 10 copies of this book away. So you just have to be someplace I can send you a flat rate U.S. Postal Service box. If you want to get a copy of the book, comment down below with the word Jonathan, or go to our website, talkflying.com, and fill out the contact form on our website and let us know that you'd like a copy. And then for flight instructors, Richard Bach has a wonderful story called School for Perfection, which really inspires us flight instructors to do the best that we can with what we have available to us. That story is in his book, A Gift of Wings. So I have 10 copies of A Gift of Wings that we're going to give away to active flight instructors or anybody who's in the training process to become a flight instructor. Again, just comment below, comment with the word perfection, or go to our website, talkflying.com, fill out our contact form, and let us know that you'd like a copy of that.
What should they do with the book when they've read it? Either book.
Good point. The other requirement of getting one of these free books is that after you're done reading it, we want you to share it with another pilot. And when you give it to them, tell them to share it with another pilot when they're done. So the goal is to get this concept of pursuing perfection out as wide as we can within the flight training industry.
Great idea. Here's what we're going to do next. This was about attitude and about what I think are the real reasons to continue flying an airplane after well over 50 years. It's a great view, and the challenges are endless. Okay? It's a tremendous way to spend your time. The teaching part, however, begins to come now. I'm going to tackle two linked subjects, stability and stalls. Both are major teaching elements for the learning pilot. The second, stalls, can be a real challenge for some people emotionally. If you don't like stalls, there is an easy answer. Do more. Okay?
Yeah.
The real goal of stall instruction is, do you like them? It's just another thing to do with an airplane, and a very interesting one at that. And then, of course, somewhere further down the line, stalls have a grown-up cousin, the spin. And spins are one of the things that I like to do most in airplanes. So if you stay with us, you're going to hear a lot about spins.
You'll get more information from us on spins than probably anywhere else on the internet. Well, that's it for episode 2. Michael, I'm really looking forward to getting into the teaching process with you. You are by far the most experienced and knowledgeable flight instructor that I have ever met. And I must confess, one of the primary motivations for me in starting up this podcast was really renewing my teaching skills so that I can teach my daughters. So I just also want to say,
That's wonderful.
Say thank you for doing this with me and helping me to get back into flight instruction. And I'm really looking forward to brushing off that rust with you in the next few episodes.
Great. Me too. See you guys.
If you'd like to help us get the message out, please like and subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and share this video podcast on your social media platforms.